Hey, Peter, welcome back to Call Me Data.
Hey, David. Welcome back. Another week has gone by,
Yeah,
and another Aloha shirt. Oh wait, is it?
another Aloha shirt. I don't even have any interesting stories about this one. I just
I
liked
can
it.
see it's
So,
brand new. They still have the lines on it.
yeah,
Like
still has the
really, it's
crease.
brand
I got it.
brand spanking new, like right out of the package.
Either that or I don't know how to use an iron. Both of those things could be true, by the way.
About a year from now, you're gonna have about 80 of these, 80 Aloha shirts.
It's going to be a problem. I'll just have to take them all and move to Hawaii. But until
Nothing wrong with
then,
that.
until then, we have a podcast to do. So, shall we jump in and talk about it?
We do. Yes, we do. And let's jump into the. Well, I can't speak clearly today. Yes, let's jump into the podcast today. So I know I found something interesting that popped up in my feed today. Actually, I'm sorry, the other day. In fact, it seems to be trending all over the place now that I kind of caught my eye. But Apple released an interesting paper about the limitations of large reasoning models. And I know we've spoken about them, and
Yeah.
in many ways, thinking they're going to be. I won't say the future. I use that term loosely, but very meaningful going forward. And they did a really interesting super analysis I found absolutely fascinating. I read it over the weekend.
Yeah.
They took four games that are um, not strategy games, but games where you can dictate the complexity of the problem pretty clearly. Like the Towers of Hanoi is a classic one, checkers being another one, whereby increasing the number say in Towers of Hanoi, the number of disks, you increase the complexity of the problem.
Okay.
And what they did was they found that as the complexity increased up to a certain point, the language models were good. And large language reasoning models work with medium reasoning complexity. But once it passed the point of certain complexity, they basically collapsed, totally collapsed. And now this was not just anyone; it was DeepSeek was one of the ones that collapsed. Claude 3.7 collapsed. And inversely, and oddly enough, as the problems got more complicated, you thought it would use more tokens. And in fact, it used far fewer during the collapse. So it was interesting, actually. And I think it was very telling that, everybody's like, well, AGI is on its way. Clearly, it's not. That there are very large limitations to the current approach. And, they didn't go into why it was there. Was it the approach it take? Was it lack of training data, for instance? They didn't go into the details. But it was fascinating. I guess what it articulated or definitely made clear was there are definitely a lot of limitations to the reasoning models that are out there today.
Right.
Um,
Right.
while helpful in certain class of problems, they're not generalizable.
Yeah, so I didn't read the whole paper, I have to confess, but I read a couple of articles about it, or actually four or five articles about it,
Yeah.
because it was being, as you said, widely covered in the press. And I think one of the conclusions that a lot of them had that was interesting and lines up with what you're saying is that, while they're not reasoning, they appear to be reasoning because they basically are incorporating, we'll say, memorization of certain thought patterns and certain types of
Right.
processes.
Right.
But I guess if you differentiate that from real reasoning, they can't actually learn. They can't actually go beyond those memorized thought patterns and processes. So
Right.
you're right.
Right.
AGI is maybe not any closer than it was a year ago, just because of the reasoning models.
Now, and I think, when you see all this stuff about how, and it's funny because we're going to have a whole conversation about lawyers now and how this is going to impact legal processing, but there are clearly some limitations. Now, look, as well as I do, things can change very rapidly and can in fact change overnight, and the space is moving, incredibly fast.
Right.
But for today, with these models, there are clear limitations, and I think it helps to understand when you're building out a solution for a system. You want to understand the limitations that are in front of you. I think that's also really
Yeah.
important.
Well, so I want to get to the conversation about the legal profession, but I just have to ask, like, in your definition of AGI, does it matter how the model gets to the level of performance it gets to? Like, if it's cheating by memorizing all the answers on a test, but yet it can answer the test better than 98% of humans, is that okay? It's not thinking, but it's still
Well,
performing. Because I think by some yardsticks, maybe we're already very close to AGI, even if the models aren't actually reasoning, right? Because they're already doing things that most humans couldn't do. So I'm just curious, like, how do you define AGI in that
I don't.
context?
I don't. That's a good question. How do you define? I don't. I look. I don't have a good definition of AGI, and I've had this conversation with a few people. Like, well, more fundamentally, just from a human perspective, what is intelligence? I
Right.
mean, what are we defining intelligent as? Is it very sophisticated pattern matching? And what is reasoning? I mean, yeah, there's a dictionary definition of it, but what really is it and how do we replicate it? And I think you're right. In many contexts and many problems, these models today way outperform humans.
Yeah.
And we're seeing them operate in places where, humans clearly can't compete in, drug development and chemical development and all these other areas where they're far eclipsing human capability. Um, but there are a lot of places where they're not, and there won't be anytime soon.
Well, so I remain convinced that AGI is not some binary, you've achieved it or you haven't. I think that we will
You're right.
look back at history at some point in the future and say, okay, roundabout here is when we achieved AGI.
Right.
Like, it's not going
Right.
to be this Rubicon that you cross and then suddenly all the lights go on and angels sing and everyone's like, ah, here we are.
Why not?
Right. I mean, sounds good. It'd make for a good movie,
It
but
does.
um,
Yes, it
but
would.
in the meantime, let's talk about something more down to earth. And you had this proposal that we talk about the impact of AI on legal profession, and my initial reaction was like, okay, lawyers will be interested, but I think that would be missing the point, because I think we're using lawyers here as a surrogate or a proxy for many other professions, and so I think I
Yes.
think a lot of people maybe know a little bit about what lawyers do. I don't think that many non-lawyers really understand everything about it, but it's relatable. And I think by
Right.
not to single out the legal profession, but I think it's a good proxy for how AI will affect lots of other knowledge work professions in the near future.
Yeah.
Besides, we have to
Yes.
pick on the legal profession because everyone's been prophesying the end of coding for so many months now that the coders are feeling just beaten up, right? Software engineers are just like,
I know.
stop picking on us. So we'll pick on someone else for a change.
Yeah, let's go to the lawyers.
Fair.
Well, come on, it's always fun beating up on lawyers. I mean, there's always the old lawyer jokes and yada yada, all that kind of fun stuff. But yeah, but you and I had an interesting discussion with a friend earlier last week. I think, which is why it was at the forefront of my thinking. And legal being a very interesting profession in certain ways, because it's obviously a heavy thought, reasoning
Hmm.
profession, but it also tends to be very closed off to technology to a large degree.
Yeah.
And they don't spend enormous sums of money on technology,
Right.
but it is one of those professions with language models and the advent of this technology you would think is going to be profoundly impacted. Don't you think?
I do think it will be, and I think as much as the legal profession, at least generally, as you said, they don't spend a large percentage of their revenue on technology. They probably underspend most similar industries in
Right.
terms of the level of education expertise required to
Hmm.
be in a law firm.
Right.
It's the weird part about it is there's also so much of what is done in the legal profession that is sometimes just very mechanical and very
Right.
much not the part that you're really paying the expertise for, right?
Right.
And obviously different forms of law, it varies. But if you're thinking about something like contract law, for example, there's a whole bunch of rote processes to go through and analyze contracts and compare them to other contracts and to
Right.
do risk analysis and things. And so I think by that metric, intuitively, I would say, there that the industry is ripe for some degree of innovation with AI.
Right. No, I agree. I agree with you. I think you're absolutely correct. And I think, like you said, is there's a lot of existing case law. There's a lot of law out there. And even to this day, when we get contracts, the first thing I do is I use a language model to interrogate it. I don't use it as an absolute, this is, the exact truth, but I use it as a good reference point to analyze
Yeah.
contracts very quickly. And it
Yeah.
makes things a lot easier. It just for me to interpret and say, rather than reading a 50-page document, I could say, hey, give me the pros and the cons. Stuff like that's incredibly helpful. But on the flip side of it is too, you would think a lawyer would use language models to create a lot of this documentation, especially the boilerplate stuff. That's very common. There's a lot of case law behind it. It's very standard stuff that for which an average individual will spend quite a bit of money on. But why not use a language model? Why not use it to, make it customizable for me? It just seems like it's a natural evolution um,
Yeah.
to do.
Well, let's also look at who who is likely to be impacted by that. So I think, I'll tell you the story, and I know you and I've talked about this one before, but I was talking with someone at a large global organization, and this person is responsible for all the legal review of contracts, commercial contracts with the organization. And
Right.
they said that when they get a contract in, one of the first things they do is they hand it to a pool of either associates or, in some cases, outsourced
Right.
experts, outsourced legal experts, and they go through and they do a series of steps. They do a risk analysis. They do a draft of what the red lines would be to the document to bring it in line with corporate policy, et cetera, et cetera. And there are hundreds of hours of that manual effort being done before
Right.
a senior attorney ever sets eyes on that contract. So
Right.
if you look at where this opportunity is, and where there might be some disruption to people in the profession, it's those associates and those legal researchers and those outsourced contractors that are doing some of that heavy lifting work. That's in
Right.
fact, the person I was talking to, that's exactly what they wanted to eventually try to displace, because they could do it far more cost effectively. So
Right, right. No, I agree. No, I think that's the logical one. That's I will say in many ways probably the easy one.
yeah,
It's the low hanging fruit. It's the go after the associates because a lot of their jobs is, in fact, like you said, it's reviewing documents, it's redlining them, it's comparison, maybe it's writing drafts, it's the simple stuff. But that kind of flips the whole model on its head too, because the traditional model for law firms is the expensive guys at the top and the whole sea of less expensive associates below. But if you start, and obviously that their billing hours are kind of functioned into the overall cost
right,
for a customer, but that starts to go away. If I'm a senior attorney now, getting billed out at $1,500 an hour, $2,000 an hour, and I could just take the same document and rather than send it over to my sea of associates, I can throw it into my AI tool and it comes back with you know redlined, updated suggestions, all based on current law, based on our existing case law, based on our historical work that we've done, and do that near instantaneously. Well, I can't really charge a customer for the amount I charged them in the
right.
past anymore.
Right. Well, that's actually going to be what's really interesting is at some point customers who are paying the bill, clients in this case, will demand to participate in that increased efficiency. And I
Right.
think that'll be the tipping point at which even firms that haven't been interested in this will suddenly find that they have to invest in AI because they're just not going to be able to sustain the bill rates. To your point, like their cost
Right.
basis will be high, and yet the prevailing
Right.
rate will be coming down, arguably. And yeah,
Right. Right. No, I think you're exactly correct, and I think you're certainly seeing a lot of external pressure on large law firms that cut costs and do things on I'll call it a project basis rather than time and materials or hourly basis.
yeah,
But I think this is going to put further cost compression on them, and ultimately change the economics of large law firms dramatically. And I will argue maybe the flip side of this too. So the pure model as it exists today, the economic model I think it exists today, is going to change dramatically. I don't think it could stay in its current form.
yeah,
The tools are just getting too sophisticated. The flip side is the law firm built around these tools has also a different set of economics because now they can compete with a larger firm far more effectively or efficiently
yeah.
than they could have in the past.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the key measures of a firm has always been its global footprint and how many partners and how many attorneys
Right.
are working there, and maybe the AI powered super firm of the future will be a dozen lawyers with an
Right.
incredible body of knowledge in their AI. But
Right.
here's the other part that's interesting to me is again, and I think this is again where there are probably some parallels between the legal profession and other industries. Going back to what you were saying about AGI, like I was speaking with a friend a few weeks ago, and he was talking about when he's a practicing attorney. He was talking about some of the greatest attorneys he's working with, and he said, at the end of the day, what makes them brilliant is not necessarily just their knowledge of the law, not that they have
Right.
memorized everything. It's their analytical capabilities, it's their
Right.
reasoning capabilities, and
Right.
in many cases, to paraphrase what he said, it's their ability to tell a story. It's their ability to
Right.
take all of this reasoning that they've done at a very high level and weave that into a convincing argument and support it with facts. So, those are all the
Right.
things that we probably are nowhere near being able to do with an AI model right now.
So let me ask you a question. You bring up a really good point, and let's go back to what we were talking about earlier, the reasoning models. One of the hypotheses that they came up with, and these models have not been exposed to more advanced forms of reasoning for the more complicated problems.
Right.
So let's take the towers of Hanoi, for instance, which, you're moving disks from one pile to another and keeping the order of the disks. It's a common problem in computer science. Now, what they said was the larger number of disks problems, so you increase the disks, you increase the complexity. There's just not a lot of examples out there, so there's not a lot of training data. But
Yeah.
law is interesting. Law is very interesting. Virtually everything is written down. Everything is codified. So when you have a lawyer that comes up with a unique approach, a unique set of, and I agree with you on the reasoning aspect of it, the brilliant ones really reason differently. They think differently. They think way out of the box, much like any smart engineer would do. You're thinking out of the box to try to solve a problem. So maybe you're right. It's not just um, their capabilities in the law and understanding the law itself, or maybe it's their reasoning, and tying and connecting the dots in a different way. But you're codifying that someplace, and I think that's what's really different. So ultimately, you have that training information. So maybe you're not replacing the $2,000 hour attorney, but you also have all this codified information that you can now bubble up to another attorney to see how they reasoned and start using that
Yeah.
information. And I think that's a bit of a game changer. So if the models aren't reasoning per se, they have access to an enormous amount of information.
No, I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. They have access to the information. You're not going to replace the $2,000 an hour, top attorney. What you might be doing is sort of cloning that person,
Right,
because you're creating models that can do some of what they
right,
do and maybe give them more reach. But that also then gets into the other challenge of this, which is, okay, let's say that you succeed in creating a super firm where you've got like 12 amazingly talented attorneys and a big investment in AI. The
right.
problem then quickly becomes when one or two of those 12 is thinking about retiring and moving on, where do the replacements come from? Because the whole pyramid model you described is, among other things, it's a farm system. It's a training
Right,
ground that takes associates and brings them up through the ranks and indoctrinates them in the ways of the firm and trains them.
right.
And if those entry level roles have been highly automated, how does a newly minted attorney become tomorrow's super expert attorney? Do you think AI could help train attorneys?
I think it's possible. I don't, I know we're going off maybe on a limb here a little bit because the tech is powerful. It's not quite yet that powerful, but
Right.
again, going back, some of the things that you and I've seen are really, truly, um, they really make you think hard because they've
Right.
gotten so sophisticated. But there is that. You learn when you're with somebody, and like you said, to a certain point, it's a system where you're teaching somebody, and there's that you pick up a lot from working with somebody that's much more senior than yourself, and
Yeah.
it's those little subtleties that you capture as a human that you're not going to easily capture in a model. It's a subtle look on their face. It's the way they move their, I don't know, move their lips, or maybe they'll raise their eyebrows. Like all that kind of stuff makes, in many cases, makes an enormous difference,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
hard to capture that stuff.
No, I think you're right, and it's interesting because as we said, this would be applicable to other industries, and what you just said is exactly what many people in the investment banking industry have said,
Right.
and in fact, it's they have said it not so much around the use of AI, but they've said it around the return to office mandate, which is a
Yes.
very similar situation, which
Yeah.
is that you've got to have young associates in the office seeing how more senior people act, think, talk, and make decisions in order to train the next generation
Right.
of leaders. So, that's sort of, if you believe that, I think, maybe law is one of many professions where there's this duality of you will have to automate and deploy AI to stay competitive. I 100% believe that to be true.
Yes.
But at the same time, you will also have to figure out how to do that while still preserving the ability to create tomorrow's class of leaders out of humans, right? Like
Right.
you're never going to replace the humans at the top of the food chain with AI. You don't want to. You want human judgment, oversight, ingenuity, and creativity.
Yes.
So how do you automate without also gutting your ability to create the people that you need tomorrow and the day after?
No, I don't have an answer for you yet on that one. And that problem, I think, exists in most industries that are undergoing
It does.
dramatic change, especially with the usage, and not just look. This is relevant in finance. It's relevant in computer programming, engineering. It's relevant in every single profession where young, new, out of college workers are learning from older individuals, and they're learning not just the facts; they're learning the nuances, and that's the kind of stuff that doesn't come across very easily. Doesn't mean you shouldn't use these tools. They're incredibly powerful. They're going to make you a lot more efficient, and you need to embrace them.
Yeah.
Um, but it doesn't mean you're not going to put somebody who's making $2,000 an hour out of business tomorrow. That's just not
No.
going to happen. Might need a few of them, but you're not going to put them out of business.
Well, so here's the way I think about it. Then,
Yeah.
given what you just said, I think if I were saying to someone, if I were telling someone what to do on this, I would say yes. Like you
Right.
absolutely need to be investing in AI. You need to be working with these technologies. You will have to deploy them, but stop thinking about it as a replacement strategy for humans and start thinking about it as
Right.
an augmentation strategy for those humans. Right?
Right.
Give them to your younger attorneys as tools to help them develop faster and help them be more productive. Now, the reality is you may need fewer of those associates because
Right.
each one of them is amplified by the technology tools that they're using, so you may need fewer of them. Now, here's the ramification of that, and this is where it gets really interesting. If you need fewer of them, that's fine, but you have to make sure that the pyramid is less like this and more like this. In other words,
Yes.
you need to make sure
Yes.
that you pick and hire and train the right associates who become the partners, who become the senior partners. You can't
Right.
afford to have the attrition rate that
Right.
has traditionally been part of most pyramid structured industries. So
Right.
I don't know.
Right.
Does that mean you
Exactly.
now have to get better and better at using AI to also hire the right people, assess the right people, train them, etc.? Like
It's a good point. I don't know.
sort of
That's a good
comes
point.
full circle.
It does, and I don't. I also take it a little step further. There are I'd say class of lawyers. There are lawyers that are very specific in certain domains, which I think are more um, prone to automation than other areas. And
Yeah.
things I look at like real estate law, for instance, not to pick on real estate attorneys, but that area tends to be, especially in residential, tends to be highly automatable. So a lot of those areas, I think you will see a significant reduction in the number of attorneys over time. I think it's going to be a natural resetting of things, like everything else. It's going to be a natural resetting. It has to occur. I don't think you can build a moat around it. I think they're going to try. And I think, like most professions, they certainly try to protect themselves from automation. Lawyers, I think, especially. But I don't think you can build a moat around it forever. I think it's just a matter of time before these tools intrude in a way that is going to be um, very disruptive.
Yeah, and
And
look, I think I agree. It's coming. It's coming for every industry. I don't mean to be singling out attorneys here. I think they're a good example. But I also would say, we don't want to overreact to it. Like I remember many years ago. So my dad was an attorney, and he was always a fairly early adopter of technology, and so he adopted the earliest IBM Selectrics with memory that could print whole
right,
documents, one page per magnetic memory card that happened to be shaped just like a punch card, um, right? And then the ones that
wow,
had onboard memory and all sorts of other IBM display writers and word processors, and eventually
yep,
electronic filing systems. And even then, there was fear about what this would do to the industry.
right,
When the local courthouse went from paper books to microfiche and microfilm for records, that created a lot of fear. So, like any industry, I think the legal industry has been subject to periodic technological revolutions. more of them will come, and
Right.
we just have to figure out how to maximize the utility while also preserving long-term value and preserving the ability to actually have a thriving industry, not cutting ourselves off at the knees to be, maximize productivity tomorrow, even if it means we can't hire and train new lawyers the day after
Right.
tomorrow.
Let me ask you a question. So if you're a senior partner in I don't know, pick 100 person law firm, you have 100 partners, or 100 attorneys, and they're sitting there going, "Wow, this is really going to impact my day to day, my life. It's going to impact my future. What do I tell my attorneys? Because I'm getting ready to retire. It's not such a big deal, but there are those that are starting out their careers. What do they do next? How do we approach it? How do you get them on board with this technology and getting them to embrace it? Because lawyers tend to be, and yes, you're right. I think there's been disruptions, but to me, it's always been around the periphery when they embrace technology, and it's for stuff that automates or makes easier document management for all intents and purposes.
Right.
It's not something that is effectively replacing their thinking. That's a different animal. How do you get them to prepare for this when they just don't, they can't wrap their minds around this?
Well, so I think I like the phrase you just said. It's not replacing their thinking. So I think the first thing I would do if I were trying to drive some, adaptation and adjustment to this inside a law firm is I would say, look, the reality is this is coming. We have to be prepared for it. We have to start working with it. It's not going to happen overnight, but we don't want to
Right.
be left in the dust. But I think the key phrase here is it isn't replacing human thinking. It's replacing human labor and effort. It's replacing time consuming work that we
Right.
do. But I think part of what you want to do is say, you still, at the end of the day, the attorneys that are hired, they're working on a matter, are still ultimately accountable for everything that is done on that. And so, they can
Right.
use, whether you're using outsourced labor in another country or you're using an AI model, you are still responsible for the work that goes out under your name. And so I think maybe part of what that is teaching people to think differently about what their job is and helping them to develop the skills that they may not have had instinctively. A lot of people are really good at doing the work, but they're not good at describing the work to someone else, and they're not good at checking the work, and they're not good at
Right.
thinking about the edge cases and systematically testing the work. Right?
Right.
You still need that core knowledge of the law and all of the skills that you have as a lawyer, but there's some skills adjustment that needs to happen to be a better supervisor than a doer.
Okay.
Right. I have
That's
an analogy in the technology
that's
industry. I was at a large bank many years ago, quite a few years ago, and we were developing some policy as code automation. And there were whole teams of people whose job, I'll say, some of them were cybersecurity, some were network security, some were other control functions. And for decades, their job had been every project design, someone needs to look at it, go through it, read all the papers, and
right.
sign off on it, right? And that was terrifically flawed. It was expensive, but more importantly, it wasn't effective because things happened that they didn't catch all the time. There were
Well, of
problems all the
course.
time. And so we said, all right, this policy as code concept was we actually built an environment where some of these policies were enforced by code. You literally could not physically deploy a database object without meeting certain criteria.
Right. Right.
And you would think this would be the greatest thing since sliced bread for this team, and instead they were terrified. They're like, "What do you
Right.
mean we're not? You expect us to not review all of these documents?" And it was a culture change to take them from a place of saying your job is, if you'd asked them at the beginning, they'd say, "My job is to read all these documents
Right.
and examine every project." What we eventually convinced them of is, no, now your job is to establish rules and guidelines, to selectively test and validate those rules, to constantly think about where the edge cases are and where those rules may need to change. But it's not to
Right.
do the work, it's to describe or prescribe the work.
Right.
What stuck with me is those are different skill sets. You can learn them,
Yes.
but just because you do it doesn't mean you're automatically good at prescribing it.
Right. Right. Now, you and I have discussed that many times, and there's going to be a skills I will say in the current workforce, a skills deficit, and there's going to be things that need people just don't do on a regular basis that they need to relearn or learn how to do. And I think you're right. Writing, describing, articulating clearly, communicating in a way other than using a whole slew of emojis, but being able to be very yeah, whole generation of teenagers coming up, well, communicating by emoji and words that make no
Yep.
sense and have no vowels, but you can't do that. But all kidding aside, that and critical thinking, which is my other bug
Yeah.
that drives me absolutely insane, being able to think and rationally question things. Um, but if you're a look at us, we're at the back end of our careers. If you're a lawyer coming through law school and you've made this heavy investment in both time and money, and all of a sudden you're faced or confronted with technology that can radically change your profession. What do you do? What do you tell this
Yeah.
group of lawyers that are coming out of school? How do you confront all this?
Well,
Because
I think you need to tell the schools. So let's take
I agree to that, yes.
whether we're talking about my example of software as a code, or whether you're talking about lawyers. Here's the thing that's always happened, right? You get out of school, and rarely when you graduate from your university or your graduate program or law school, medical school, whatever it is, right? You're usually not a supervisor on day one. You're an associate. You're a worker, right? And then you gradually get more responsibility. And at some point in your career, you go from being a sole contributor or a team member to being a supervisor or a manager, right? But and along the way, there's a whole bunch of additional learned skills and behavior. And we could go,
Right.
we could talk all day about, how often it is that people don't learn those skills and behaviors, and then they're thrust into a management position and they are terrible at it. But
Right.
set aside, typically, in theory, you learn those things. I think, the world you just described is one in which someone graduates from their educational program and they are immediately put in a position of being a supervisor because they are supervising intelligent agents. They are supervising the use of AI models. They're reviewing the work created by non-humans. And
Right.
yet they haven't been trained in their educational program to be a supervisor. They've been trained to do the work, and it was always assumed that that supervisory training would just happen, that they would just absorb it over the first 5 or
Right.
10 years of their career. So maybe
Right.
we need to change what we're doing to prepare people for careers.
100% agree with you, and I would say that that point is valid across numerous professions. But let's take, as well as I do, uh, institutions such as our universities don't change fast. And then take it a step further, you get something like law, for instance, which is, they're accredited by the law programs are accredited by, I think it's the American Bar Association. So they have all these accreditations in terms of what is a lawyer. They have to learn X, Y, and Z in order to become an attorney. Now, as well as I do, changing that thinking is going to be virtually impossible because there is that want and desire to create a moat around a profession to protect it. Now, universities are not going to change so fast. Nobody's going to be the one out there going, you know what? Things are changing. We're doing it. Let's go. Regardless of what anyone else thinks, they're just not going to be the one. It's just not going to happen. What forces this change? What forces this to happen? Like, what makes it there a fundamental shift of how you teach? Because you're right. Going forward, what are you going to do? You're going to do. You're basically going to be looking at a whole bunch of agents doing some of this work for you and acting as a supervisor. Something if you come out of today's university, you're woefully unprepared for.
Yeah, look, I think in a perfect world, everyone would get their heads around this and they would be proactive and they would make these changes. And right, like as you said, it's very unlikely that's going to happen. So
Right.
I think the driving force here will simply be necessity, and which is a pretty way of saying people are going to screw up. They're going to make mistakes. It's going to be a problem, and then we'll figure it out. Right?
Right.
It was the same thing with remote working. Right? Before COVID, a lot of companies had zero capability for people to log in remotely and do their
Right.
work remotely. Necessity forced it. I was working for a company when Superstorm Sandy hit Manhattan and the building flooded, and no one had laptops, no one had remote dial-in
Right.
capability. All work stopped for 30 days while a team of people literally set up trucks and tents in a parking lot in New Jersey and night and day unloaded tractor trailers full of laptops and configured them and delivered them to people.
Wow.
Right. And it was a massive undertaking. So I think my realistic view is necessity will be the driving factor, and that will be it'll just, people will stumble and they'll realize we have to figure this out.
No, fair enough. Necessity, or I'll say competition. But yeah,
Yeah.
yes,
Yep.
I agree with you. I think
Yep.
you're right. It's probably necessity.
Yeah.
It will eventually happen. But so let's pivot for a second over here. I know we can beat this dead horse for quite a while, and I think we'll flagellate it to death at some point. But if you were recommending a roadmap for managing partners at a law firm, what would you tell them? And knowing that this is not gonna you're not gonna wake up tomorrow and your livelihood's gonna evaporate overnight, but it's coming in the next, say, 2 to 5 years. What do you
Yeah.
tell them? Like, how do you prepare them for this? Assuming they're even ready to hear the message.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't think that my advice to a senior partner would differ that much from the way we advise CEOs and business leaders in other industries, which is,
Right.
I think you need to do a couple of things. You need to do some of the foundational work. You need to start to examine your technology infrastructure. You need to understand what data and what knowledge assets you have. You need to understand the processes that drive your business, even if those are implicit and not explicitly written down.
Right.
I think you also then need to begin experimenting and learning about how to deploy this in your environment, because
Right.
everything that you just described is way too important to just take an off-the-shelf AI and say this will be my new AI. Right? You've got to be able to have your unique value proposition expressed in those AI models. So I think
Right.
starting the journey, if you really want to get down to it, start the journey, build the foundations. I would never tell anyone we know where this is going to go. I would say the train is moving and you need to be, if not jogging alongside it, ready to hop on, you need to be like,
I know.
on the train.
Yep. Always
We're not
following the
sure where
train.
it's headed, but we know that once it's fully gone from the station, it's going to be very hard to catch up.
No, agree. And we do know that there are some things that are foundational and are not going to change. And we can say, I think, pretty emphatically that getting your data in shape, getting it collected, getting it in one place, tagging it properly are steps that you have to take no matter what.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
those, regardless of where the train winds up and where AI goes and what happens next, those are things you're going to, because that ultimately is your value prop. That's your information. That's what makes you unique as a law firm. It's having all
Inescapable.
that information.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. Well, listen,
You know,
as we wrap this up, I'd love to first of all, apologies to any attorneys, lawyers out there who are dismayed by hearing us talk about the impact of AI in your profession. But trust me, you're not alone. Even the work that
no,
we do is, everything is under pressure from AI. So don't feel bad
right.
that we singled you out. I would also just be curious. I would love to hear what any early career attorneys think, or even anyone who is thinking about law as a profession. Have any of you rethought it? Have any of you changed your mind, or
Yeah, good question.
what do you think about this? Like, does it make you more or less excited about the field of law as a profession?
Yeah,
Let
no,
us
we'd love
know.
to hear from you. Please, no, I
Yeah.
think your input would be incredibly valuable. I mean, obviously, like I think you brought up a great point, David. Reach out to us, please. There are multiple channels, but we'd love to hear what you have to say. I'm actually truly fascinated at where you think this is going to go and how it's going to impact you, and if we can help you in that journey.
I'd love to. I'd love to. The idea maybe someday we could get some lawyers and aspiring lawyers on as guests and just sort of have a hot debate about the future of law and AI and where this is all going.
That would
Love
be
to
a
hear what
great
other people
discussion to
think.
have.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be a great discussion to have. I would love to have that. And maybe somebody that reaches out to us will be the first victim.
Yeah. Exactly. All right.
I say that sarcastically. All right, David. I know we're winding down on this one, and it's always a absolute pleasure having this conversation.
Yes, and thank you for joining us. I promise to iron my shirt next week, and
Yes, please. I want to see it ironed.
yeah, and thanks again, Peter. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, David. Listen, you have a
All
great
right,
day.
thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks for
Bye.
joining. Bye. Bye now.